Hi, friends. Welcome to this Zoom call. This is part of the Let's Talk About Mysticism program on Patreon. I'll tell you more about that in a few minutes. But right now, I'd like to introduce myself. I am Carl McColman, and I also go by the name Skye. And I am the author of a number of books, which we'll be talking about in a few minutes, but also the Anam Cara newsletter on Substack. So, what I'd like to do tonight is talk to you a little bit about one of my books, the Big Book of Christian Mysticism, or the second edition of it, which is known as the New Big Book of Christian Mysticism. And so I'd like to introduce myself, tell you a little bit about me, and a little bit about how I came to write this particular book, to write about mysticism. And then we'll just begin to get a taste of the book itself by looking at the preface and chapter 1 of the book. So I'll try to keep this brief about me. I was very much part of a kind of a Leave It to Beaver kind of a family, a white middle class suburban American family. I was born in 1960, so I'm a child of the 60s and the 70s. And I suppose in many ways I had a reasonably typical childhood. But when I was 16 years old, at a weekend church camp, I had what I think I can only call a spiritual awakening. Now, the church camp was called Winter Celebration. It took place in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. It was a weekend for Lutheran high school youth. My mom and dad and I were members of a Lutheran church. And while I was at that weekend event on Saturday night, during the weekend communion service, I had an experience in which my heart and my soul just seemed to open up to love, to light, to a sense of connection, not only to everybody in that room, but really to all things. It was deeply beautiful, deeply moving, and it really set me on a lifelong trajectory of interest in the interior life, interest in spirituality, and eventually interest in mysticism. And the story there is that a friend of mine loaned me the book that you see on the screen, Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill. She was a British writer who died in 1941. The book came out in 1911, so it is an older book. And I read that right after I graduated from high school, and it really just opened up my heart because it gave me a language with which I could describe kind of what had happened to me. And I could situate my experience of feeling, really at one with the Spirit, with God, with the divine, whatever language you might want to use, which I wasn't looking for that experience, and I certainly had no language or any way to contextualize that experience. And Evelyn Underhill's book on mysticism kind of gave me that connection. So I became a lifelong student and kind of follower of mystical spirituality, and not just Christian mysticism, even though obviously my experience happened very much in a Christian context, but also world mysticism. We'll talk more about that in a few minutes too. When I was in graduate school, I did my graduate work at George Mason University outside of Washington, D.C. And I got connected to an organization in DC called the Shalem Institute. Shalem is still going strong. As you can see from the slide, they just celebrated their 50th anniversary. Shalem was founded by an Episcopal priest who had studied with a Tibetan Buddhist a teacher, and that particular teacher said to him, your tradition has its own heritage, its own deep spirituality, and that maybe you should devote your life to helping others to reconnect with this kind of lost tradition, this lost mystical or contemplative tradition within Christianity. And so Tilden took him at his word and started the Shalem Institute. When I was in graduate school, I got plugged in there, and that introduced me to the practice of centering prayer, the practice of spiritual direction, and really helped me to take kind of the ideas that I learned from Evelyn Underhill and embody them, make them part of my own spiritual practice. Now, obviously, all of this is happening in a Christian context, and Christian mysticism has remained very important to me. But I should also mention that I've really, from my teen years, I've been interested in interspirituality and interfaith dialogue in world wisdom traditions beyond just the Christian. The image on this on the screen is of the Celtic Wheel of the Year, and so that's emblematic of a deep interest I have in Celtic spirituality, not just Celtic Christianity, but kind of indigenous Celtic spirituality. We could call it the Druids, but even that word is maybe not the most helpful word. Just, I would prefer to say indigenous Celtic spirituality. People also call it pagan spirituality. I also became interested, and I think kind of following Tilden Edwards and his being a student of Buddhism, I became very much interested in Eastern spirituality, particularly in various forms of Buddhism as well. So here I was kind of anchored in the Christian tradition, but deeply open to, interested in, and respectful of other wisdom traditions from around the world. Now, I got my master's degree in professional writing and editing, and so writing has always been something that I have loved to do. And I began writing about mysticism and spirituality. At first, very much from this kind of maybe interspiritual perspective. I had several books published beginning in 1997 with spirituality. My second book was called The Aspiring Mystic. I wrote several other books, including some books that did have more kind of that indigenous or pagan spirituality, maybe even goddess centered. I wrote Embracing Jesus and the Goddess, The Spirit of the Celtic Gods and Goddesses. So a number of books that just embodied my kind of broad focused interest in the mystical life. 366 Celts, kind of a daily devotional based on Celtic wisdom and Celtic spirituality. But eventually, I guess how would I put it? I guess that the Christian tradition always had kind of pride of place in my heart and a deep love for that tradition. I grew up in the Christian context. And so after I moved to Atlanta, when I got married in 1993, I relocated to Atlanta and I became connected to the Trappist Monastery here in Georgia, Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Conyers, Georgia. And there I began to study with the monks themselves. And again, had just another way to kind of contextualize my own spirituality and to really kind of reconnect very much with a deeply kind of Christian expression of the mystical life. And I think it was around that time, I was maybe only a year or two into my studies with the monks, that I had an editor who I had worked with on several of those books that I had written previously call me and ask me what I was writing about. And at first, I thought maybe I should do a book on world mysticism. I was actually teaching a class on world mysticism at Emory University in their continuing education department. And so, I pitched that to the editor, and he said, no, that was too broad. I need you to narrow it down. So I thought, well, would you like maybe a book on the Eastern, no, not the Eastern, on the Western traditions of mysticism? I was thinking I could write about Christian mysticism, but also about Kabbalah, maybe about Sufism, maybe even again that indigenous Celtic kind of thing. And he said, no, I want you to narrow it down even further. And so at that point I said, well, would you like a book on Christian mysticism? I wasn't sure that there was, a market, that there would be demand for a book on such kind of a narrow topic. But my editor liked it. And he said, no, go ahead and write up a proposal. And so I did. And the publisher accepted the proposal. And that's how the big book, the original edition, the Big Book of Christian Mysticism came to be. So, it did really well. And that just led me to continue writing. And so I've published a number of other books: Answering the Contemplative Call, Befriending Silence, Eternal Heart. My most recent book, Read the Bible Like a Mystic. Another Celtic book, Invitation to Celtic Wisdom. So I really feel like I've been very blessed with the opportunity to continue to do what I love, mainly because of that Christian mysticism book and how well it has been received. And then in 2023, I was very blessed to be able to bring out a second edition, the new Big Book of Christian Mysticism. I think the title's a little clunky, but it gets the message across. And it's actually 100 pages longer than the first edition. So if you've read the first edition, I would encourage you to check out the new edition as well, because it is a considerably longer book, rewritten or at least closely edited from, beginning to end, with 5 new chapters of material. And so it really does reflect the fruit of just, at that time, probably about 12 years of continual study and reflection, and as well as my own contemplative practice. So why did I write a book on Christian mysticism? Well, it goes back to hearing Anne Lamott, a talk that she gave that was broadcast on public radio. And this was, of course, years and years ago, before the first edition of the book was written. I was driving home. I think I was working at the monastery at that point. Driving home one night, I heard this talk from Anne Lamott on public radio, and she is talking about her work as a writing teacher. And she says that one of the things that she always tells her students is to write the book you wish you could have read. And when I heard that, immediately I was electrified, because I knew exactly what that book was for me. And that was basically to take Evelyn Underhill's book, which, as I mentioned, came out in 1911, to take that book and bring it into the 21st century. You know, so in many ways, my book on Christian mysticism is an homage to Evelyn Underhill, an homage to her pioneering work on taking mysticism kind of out of the monastery, out of the cloister, and making it a topic that's accessible for everyone. So, I'll let history and readers be the judge if I did a good job in my appreciation of Underhill or not. But that certainly was very much a motivating factor for me. Another motivating factor for me was to really kind of reflect on and respond to the 2 sentences that you now see on the screen. And the first one comes from Karl Rahner. The second one I've seen quoted to several different people. I'm not sure who said it first. But the first sentence, the Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist. Now that is a line that could almost seem kind of intimidating. But I think it's a challenge, and not just for Christians. I think it's for all spiritual seekers, that an authentic spirituality is a mystical spirituality, a spirituality that is steeped in silence and in mystery and in experience. So Rahner, who himself, of course, he was a Jesuit, he was a Catholic theologian, he's kind of challenging the Christian community. He's saying, folks, we need to reconnect with our mystical heart and our mystical tradition. But then this other quote, I think, is a beautiful counterbalance to that. The mystic is not a special kind of person, but each person is a special kind of mystic. So mysticism is not some rarefied thing that only monks or saints or nuns or, the specially called and chosen people do, but it is really a vocation, a calling for everyone. In the Catholic world, they have this concept of the universal call to holiness. I believe there's a universal call to contemplation and mysticism. And so my book kind of, in responding to Karl Rahner's challenge, I really want to make the case that this is a topic for everyone, not just for the people who are super spiritual or super saintly or anything like that. So, so the questions that I try to answer in this book. Obviously, what is mysticism? It's a word that for many people it's vague. It's not easy to define, and I get into why I think that's so. Why does this topic matter? Well, why is mysticism important? Why is it something that the ordinary person like you and me should care about? Is it for everyone? And I guess I've already kind of tipped my hand, here on this Zoom call. Of course, I believe it's for everyone, but I try to make the case as to why I believe that is so. Is it for me? Obviously, for the individual reader, is this something that you can connect to? Obviously, I can't tell anybody what they should do with their spiritual lives or their lives in general, but I certainly want to make sure the invitation is set out there. And then where do I go from here? If I do think this is something that is meant for me, that is meant for my heart, my spiritual life, what are the next steps that I can take? So those are the questions that I really try to address as I explore this topic. Now, I mentioned earlier, that obviously I have a love not just for Christian mysticism, but really for the mystical spiritualities of the world. And, so that's a tension that I think drives this book and probably really drives my entire work, as a writer and as a teacher, retreat leader, and so forth. Great love for the Christian tradition. I believe that Christian mysticism has a unique beauty and a unique splendor that can stand toe to toe to any other mystical tradition from around the world. But there are also challenges, obviously, with institutional Christianity. Many people have had very bad experiences with the institutional church. Sometimes that can be a barrier for people, to discover, the deep and mystical heart of the Christian tradition. By contrast, when we start talking about world mysticism, and I think we get back to what my editor said, it can be such a vast topic. Every one of the great wisdom traditions has its own mystical lineage with a library of writings and of wisdom teachings and of practices associated with each one. So, I don't think there's any way one human being in one lifetime could, even, become proficient, let alone a master of all of the world's great traditions. But I do think being informed by other traditions can help to deepen whatever tradition that we have, we ourselves feel called to walk upon. So I don't assume that the readers of my book are necessarily identify as Christian. Um, but obviously, I assume that some of my readers will identify as Christian. So I've tried to make this a book that for people who are walking the Christian path, it's an invitation to go deeper in their particular spiritual practice. But for others who maybe have that broader focus, this is an invitation to celebrate the uniquely Christian perspective on mysticism, which may be different from other perspectives, but there's also seems to be a deep underlying unity between all of the great mystical wisdom traditions around the world. So I hope that I've done a good job at honoring that as well. So let's take just a few minutes and look at the preface of the book, and then just the first chapter, and then I want to share with you a little bit more about this project that I'm beginning with this particular Zoom call. So, the very first sentence in the book, I believe, is the most important sentence in the book. If you're only going to read one sentence, read this one, reflect on it. Um, Love is real, God is love, and God dwells in your heart. Now, immediately I know, we can ask, what is love? We can ask, what is God? We can ask, what do we mean about God dwelling in our heart? What's that all about? So obviously this sentence immediately carries with it, a wide number of questions. That's typical of mystical writing. And not that I necessarily claim I myself am a mystical writer, but writing about mysticism, hopefully I've captured some of that spirit here. That mystical writing or writing about mysticism typically tends to ask as many questions as it answers. Probably it asks more questions than it answers. Having said that, I hope this sentence can be evocative for you and can really just begin to set the stage of where this book is inviting you, inviting me, inviting us. Mysticism is many things. It is Christianity's best kept secret. Obviously, in the preface of the book, I'm just beginning to kind of offer, how do I want to put this? I want to whet the reader's appetite. I want to encourage the reader. Gee, let's explore this. Let's try to answer some of these questions. And so it seems to me that a lot of people might pick up this book and they might say, well, I've been going to church my whole life. I've never heard of mysticism before. What is Christian mysticism? So immediately, I just want to acknowledge that there are many corners of institutional Christianity that don't talk about mysticism. Or if they do talk about it, they're suspicious of it. They say you should stay away from it, you know. So there is this kind of hidden quality, which ironically, one of the meanings of the word mysticism is that which is hidden. And so certainly mystical Christianity fits the bill. It is hidden not only in our culture at large, but even in Christian spaces. Oftentimes you have to go looking for it to find it. Once you go looking for it, and this is the other thing that I say about it, is it's hidden in plain sight. You suddenly realize it's everywhere. I just haven't been trained to look for it and to be able to recognize it. So I begin to just say a few things here. Mystical spirituality opens us up to the love of God, but it insists that we give up all of our limited or limiting ideas and concepts about God. Those are mental idols. That anything we say about God, on one hand, can help us to connect closer to the divine mystery, but on another hand, if we're not careful, can actually set up a barrier. It can close things off. A great example is the whole question of God and gender. Obviously, there's a long tradition, not only within Christianity, but other faiths, Judaism and Islam, of depicting God as male, God the Father, using the he pronouns for God. Um, for many people, that is intimate, it's touching, they connect with the idea of a loving father. But for others, especially people who grew up with an abusive father, that can actually be a barrier. And then there's the whole question, uh, of the 50% of the human race that is female, that are women, girls and women, they might need to connect with an image of God that is feminine, that looks like them, as they say. And so we have to ask, does talking about God the Father, it might teach us something about God, but it also might create a limitation around God too. So mysticism invites us to begin to let go of those images, those ideas, those words that maybe on some levels can help us, but on other levels can get in the way. I go on to say that deeper you go, the more elusive God becomes. God is playing a game of hide and seek with us here. Yet the deeper you go, the more you realize that you are the living embodiment of divine love. We look for God out in the universe and we find God in our hearts. It's a profound mystery. It's at the heart of the mystical life. I say mysticism is like a kaleidoscope. It's colorful, it's prismatic, forming endless images of beauty and wonder out of a small number of ordinary objects. The basic elements of mystical theology, mystical ideas, teachings, theories, and spirituality, the practice, the embodied part, are surprisingly humble and earthy. Like a kaleidoscope, these same basic bits and colors continually appear and reappear, forming new patterns of beauty as they tumble together in different ways. Mysticism is actually very simple. The elements of it, the elements of the practice, very, very simple, but how they combine in our hearts, how they combine maybe in community at large, seem to be continually shifting, maybe from generation to generation, from century to century. It's all part of kind of this dynamic dance. All right, so let's now take a brief look at the first chapter of the book. There are actually 22 chapters. First chapter is called The Transfiguring Moment. And so I start by telling the story of a podcast that I was interviewed on a while back, where the interviewer just point blank asks me, well, was Jesus a mystic? And I say, yes. I say, of course, I believe Jesus was a mystic. And the evidence that I give is from the New Testament, from the Bible, the story of the Transfiguration. You can see the icon on the slide there. That Jesus takes a couple of his closest friends. They climb to the top of the mountain. And at the top of the mountain, they have a vision, an apparition of Moses and Elijah. And Jesus himself begins to glow. You see that beautiful halo with the kind of the blue star there, radiant white light, beautiful light, shining like the sun. And you can see that his friends, the disciples, they fall to the ground. They're kind of in awe, or maybe even a little bit of frightened, fear kind of showing up. But Jesus expresses this kind of mystical beauty. He has the conversation with Moses and with Elijah, and then when that's all said and done, he basically tells his followers, "Listen, you've seen something very special. Keep it a secret until after, and this is before he was killed, after my death and my resurrection." And I can imagine the followers saying, the disciples saying, what does he mean by the resurrection? Of course, they would go on to find out. Yeah, let me say right now, this is the tradition, this is the teaching. I understand people who don't identify as Christian may not necessarily say, I don't know that I believe in the resurrection. Okay, that's fair. Within the Christian tradition, that is an important part of the story. So I'm telling the story here as it's understood within the Christian context. And I just invite you, if it's not necessarily something you believe in, to at least accept it kind of on a mythical level, to understand that this has been a meaningful story, part of the 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 meaningfulness of the Christian tradition is this idea that Jesus is the embodiment of God. He is the Son of God, as is said, and that the expression of that is that even death could not contain him, that he rose from the dead after 3 days. So I then take this amazing story of the Transfiguration and I compare it to a similar story involving a mere mortal, an ordinary human being, in this case, a man named Thomas Merton, who was a Trappist monk who lived in Kentucky at the Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky. And the story goes that in 1958, the spring of 1958, he has to go into Louisville, Kentucky on a business trip, on an errand for the monastery. Monks don't normally just, go into town just for kicks. But in this case, he had a legitimate reason. He had to run this business errand. And he's in town. He's walking around. It's a beautiful spring day, or I think it's a beautiful spring day. It's a spring day because it was in March. And he gets to a street corner and he says he suddenly fell in love with everybody he saw. And he says that they all were walking around shining like the sun. Doesn't that sound like the Transfiguration? It's like in Merton's eyes, all the human beings that he saw suddenly became transfigured, just like Jesus was transfigured 2,000 years earlier. And his response was one of love. He said, I fell in love with everyone. He goes on to say, there's no way that I can tell you how to see this. There's no program for this seeing, but the gate of heaven is everywhere. The recurring theme among the mystics is that the beauty and the splendor and the light of the mystical path is something that is available to us almost everywhere we turn. The question is, do we have the eyes to see it? So Jesus proclaims himself, I am the light of the world. But he also tells his followers, you are the light of the world. Jesus is saying, I'm not the only one that gets to be transfigured. We all do. So perhaps the Transfiguration represents the embodiment of Jesus as light. And Merton's experience is an example of somebody being able to see how we are all the light of the world. Now, let's look at another story, this time from a Catholic saint, a Carmelite saint named Teresa of Avila, who lived in Spain in the 16th century, the 1500s. And she has a vision of an angel. On the surface, it almost sounds scary. The angel has a spear, and he plunges it in her. But it is, of course, this is a vision, so she's not really getting punctured by a spear. And what she realizes is that the spear is kind of symbolic of God's pouring God's spirit into her heart and God's love into her heart. So it is an expression that we could almost say is erotic, and erotic kind of in the broadest and highest sense of the word, deeply embodied, deeply passionate, deeply beautiful, and love from top to bottom. She says the angel left her utterly consumed with love of God. The pain was so intense it made her moan. The sweetness, the anguish that it carried with it was so bountiful that she could never wish for it to cease. The soul will not be content with anything less than God. So right away we see this kind of mystical experience, filling her with love, filling her with passion, filling her with longing and desire for God, and finding that that desire is just the most sweetest and beautiful thing she has ever experienced. So again, I think it's kind of like what happened to me when I was, 16 years old. I say it changed my life. I think what happened to Merton changed his life. What happened to Teresa changes her life. Mystical spirituality is in the business of transforming lives. So the interesting question is, how do we want our lives to be transformed? How would we like to invite the spirit of love into our hearts and our lives so that we may respond to that love in a way that is creative and life enhancing and just fills our lives with possibility? So mysticism, it's a story that begins in silence and only takes on the form of language and narrative after the fact. We say that mysticism involves experience, the experience of union with God, but experience is not the entire story either. Mysticism affirms the mystery of God more than mere experience. Sometimes God chooses to encounter us deep beneath the horizon of our awareness. So I'm hinting at something that will continue to expand throughout the book, and that's the idea that mystical spirituality involves paradox. That almost anything you can say about the mystical life, you can say something very different or even its opposite, and that has authenticity and truth about it as well. So we say mysticism is about experiencing God. But the mystics wrote books with titles like The Cloud of Unknowing or The Dark Night of the Soul. So the mystics, they're telling us you don't always experience God. Sometimes God is at a level below our conscious experience. So, anybody watching this Zoom call or anybody reading, not only my book, but any kind of book on mystical spirituality, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I've never had an experience of God, does that make me chopped liver? No, it doesn't make you chopped liver, but it does leave us open to the possibility that the way the Spirit moves in your heart is so subtle that it's almost like it's undercover. It's like love is an undercover agent in your heart and in your life. It's a theory to consider. So silence, always been associated with mystical spirituality and contemplative practice. It helps us to notice and name our experience of God, but it can also undermine and subvert any experience. In other words, this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Our language is always incomplete. We have to talk about God because how else do we communicate with one another what we've experienced, what we felt, what we know in our heart to be true? But then there's a humility in recognizing that our language can only take us so far. Silence gently helps us to see that any experience of God, no matter how beautiful and powerful it might be, it is limited and incomplete. And so, it's human nature to want to put our experiences into words, but there's something to be said for holding them in the silence of our hearts as well. So the point behind mysticism is not to dazzle ourselves with ecstatic wonders, but to foster real and lasting changes, to become more like Christ, which is to say more compassionate, more forgiving, more committed to serving others and making the world a better place. So this is what kind of mysticism invites us into. A life given over to love, a life given over to compassion and care and joy. All these qualities that then embody in how we conduct our lives and how we relate to others. Well, that is, again, just kind of a brief overview of the preface and chapter 1 of the book. So this call is the first of a series, and it is my intention now over the months to come to do a series of Zoom calls where I lead the participants in a walk through the book together. And so if you've read the new big book of Christian mysticism or even the first edition and you'd like to kind of get from the horse's mouth a little bit more insight into the book and what the book has to say, I hope you'll consider joining me for this series. If you've never read the book, obviously I hope that this series will not only be nurturing and useful in and of itself, but I also hope it might inspire you to go back and check out the book. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning that this is part of a program that I run on the Patreon website called Let's Talk About Mysticism. Obviously, that's what I'm doing right now. So let me tell you about that. The program actually is it is a subscription-based program. The prices start at $11 a month, and at any level, you get 3 Zoom calls with me each month, and they're different topics. So obviously, there will be a series where we will be continuing with the new big book of Christian mysticism, and I'll do a chapter or two each time we gather. And if you can't make it, if it conflicts with something else on your schedule, the recording will be made available on Patreon after the fact, so you'll always have access to that. I'm also doing another series where we do a walkthrough of another book. The book we're currently working on right now is by Evelyn Underhill, obviously an author I value very highly. Her wonderful book called Practical Mysticism. It's a more accessible book than that one that I read back, when I graduated from high school. And then the third call is just an open-ended call where, the community gathers with me. It's a chance to, ask me questions. It's a chance for us to just reflect together on whatever issues might be coming up in people's lives, maybe a little bit of kind of group spiritual direction. I should also mention that every one of the calls will also always include a period of centering prayer. So 20 minutes of silent prayer. And the reason why we do that is because I believe that, any kind of study or even conversation about the mystical life is enhanced and deepened when we are in touch with the silence in our own hearts. So it's always important to begin with that period of silence, and then we move into the presentation. Certainly on the calls where we're discussing books, I'll do a presentation. Those presentations will be recorded and made available after the fact. And then we have the conversation. The conversation is not recorded, so you really do have to be on the call to participate in that. And that's mainly just to protect people's privacy. So if you're, a little nervous, I promise you absolutely that, the only the recordings involving me giving presentation eventually get made available. That, that the part where we're having, interaction is that's just for that particular call. So again, this begins at just $11 a month. There's a couple of tiers at which you can purchase your membership. Let me just say something a little bit about Patreon. Patreon was established as a crowdfunding tool, a tool for people who want to support writers, artists, musicians, podcasters, folks like that. And and so I've been a part of Patreon now for almost 10 years. Patreon literally is a big part of what keeps me in business as a writer. And, I don't get outside funding from, a big kind of corporation. I don't work for the church, nothing like that. I am 100% user supported. So obviously people who see me for spiritual direction, they provide some support. I do get some royalties from books, but let's be real. Books on mystical spirituality usually don't hit the New York Times bestseller list. So all of those kind of revenue streams are relatively modest. So the support that comes through Patreon literally makes a huge difference in how I can continue to be creating new content, for, not only the writing, obviously, but also doing programs like this. So what we've learned over the years with Patreon is that members really do appreciate when programming is made available, particularly for them in consideration of their support. And so that's what, these Zoom calls and the recordings from these Zoom calls are meant for. They are meant for the people who do want to, out of generosity, they want to support the work that I do. Now, if you decide Patreon is not for you, you can subscribe to my Substack for free. Of course, you can make a financial contribution there. Be very clear, but you can support. You can sign up for free. You can continue to read my writing. I mean, that's part of what the generous people who support my work do. Is they help me to be able to create contemplative writing for the general public. Because I understand this. Not everybody necessarily can afford $11 a month. That's the way the world works. It's fine. And so I will always have content available for the general public, but for those who want to go a little bit deeper and who want to have that connection with me, I certainly hope that you'll consider joining Patreon and then, being able to be part of these Zoom calls that we do each month. So here you have, a QR code. Please, just scan that, and that'll take you right to the sign up page for Patreon, or you can just type in the URL. You can see that, at the bottom of the slide. And I really just appreciate those of you who choose to support my work and be part of the circle in that way. And, I just invite you to join us, and let's just go deeper with mysticism. Again, the Patreon program is called Let's Talk About Mysticism. I hope that we can do that, and that, you and I can get to know each other, and you can, I think even more important, get to know the other people in the Patreon circle. It's not a huge community, but there are a number of folks, obviously, who are very very excited to be sharing their interest in contemplative and mystical spirituality. This is something I hear from people all the time. They get drawn into the contemplative life and they say, I have nobody to talk to. And so, come and join me at a couple of Zoom calls each month. And it's not just me. There are other people on the call that share this interest and are certainly willing to be engaged in conversation. So there you go. That's the pitch. I hope that you'll prayerfully consider joining us. And if you do, I look forward to meeting you and connecting with you on Zoom.